In my pursuit of the family story, I wasn't worried about the disappearance of Bunnag histories. I was concerned with capturing atmosphere, character, and coherence. Lines of descent are useful, but they don't speak of much. And the histories seem rather straight-laced. Everyone was always so good and decent. What about disgrace? What about personality? I felt that the family consciousness had shaped all of us to an extent, but it was a frustrated thing, a conflict between something powerful that was intimated, but was hard to grasp, and without texture. I wanted to know what traces of historical events were retained and passed on inside our family, believing it to be our real inheritance. I had an idea of each member of the family being told something of the long family story. What if I could gather all of this folklore together and stitch it into one big tapestry? As a tentative oral historian, I immediately encountered problems coaxing stories out of people because there was no real structure to contain the anecdotes, and the context and background about the various characters was too complex to be expressed in a pithy manner. I found that things could be expressed around an object, a place, or a specific event, and these all required explanation. As I was researching, I imagined that I would stumble across a stack of old journals by Chuang, for instance, or some kind of personal record by Warren of his travels in Europe. I found very little, which is surprising because we know that these powerful figures had personal scribes following them around, recording everything. So what happened? It seemed as if there was a gaping hole in the conventional history which mentions the figures of the 19th century but skirts around them. For my purposes, I ended up poring over foreign accounts of Siam, but this wasn't as straightforward as it may sound. One of the most exasperating issues in Thai history is the naming of individuals. There are no surnames, so that only consistent names are nicknames. The royally bestowed titles shift. Every time someone is promoted, they become someone else, and the titles belong to the holder of the office, not the individual. The issues are compounded by transliteration. This is really slow. Okay, there we go. Take one, for instance. When he visited France in 1861, the French called him Prat Navai, not Juan Bunnag. Prat Navai is a transliteration of part of the title of the king's sword-bearer, a title that had been held by Dit and Chuang, with Chuang appearing in foreign records on numerous occasions as Nai Wai. One would become Jalpriya Surawong Wayawat, which is very close to Jalpriya Surawong Watanasak. Even family members get muddled up with this, and that name Surawong can be Suriawong or Suriwong. In the case of Chuang, he gets a load of different names, including Kunsit, which becomes Konset, and Kunsit, and is also part of Nai Wai title. And Dit gets Praklang, his title, but the title exists generally and belonged to King Rama III when he was Praklang, immediately prior to Dit. Because the family story is generally about the successes and achievements, whenever I chanced across something unsavory, I leapt at it. It can be no surprise that men who wielded great power were responsible for unpleasant deeds. In an article by Edward Van Roy about the Bunnag genealogy, he mentioned the execution of Dat's first son and heir, a man called Sanit. Sanit had been accused of having a love affair with a royal lady, and there is suggestion that Dit, his uncle, was involved in his trial and execution, which must have been in the mid-19th century. Family members either didn't know, or it fell into a certain category of questions to which I received enigmatic replies, often including warnings. In the case of Sanit, I imagine that it worked itself out through later events, but I have no evidence, just a conjecture. The narrative follows the daughter Sanit had before he was killed, whose grandson, Jalpriya Surasak Montri, would become a key figure in King Rama V's military, and although he was a kind of Bunnag, he played a role in the undoing of Bunnag power networks. He would be Field Marshal of the Siamese army and was the uncle of my great-grandmother Son, who was my grandfather's mother. With this in mind, the marriage between this family and that of my sort of mainstream Bunnag great-grandfather looks like a reconciliation. It's speculative, but it's within the realm of possibility. And this is how things go from historical facts to hearsay and speculation. To give another example of this vagueness in Thai history, one of the most intriguing episodes of the 19th century Thai history is what is known as the Front Palace incident. This was a showdown between King Rama V and the so-called Second King, or Front Palace King, and this occurred in the 1870s and almost saw fighting with the possibility of military intervention by the British, which could have led to colonization. It's an incredibly convoluted episode that becomes even more confusing because it cannot be adequately or comfortably expressed. The possibility of insult is still a danger. This happened 150 years ago, and yet the mainstream histories are vague. They might say there had been tensions between various political factions and these came to a head. It's a subject that deserves some examination and patience because it marks the end of the old system that had characterized Bangkok's governance for most of its existence and the beginning of the absolute monarchy that was to last until 1932. But of course, nothing is that simple. Things don't end and begin so neatly. This Front Palace incident is passed over too quickly because it hints at uncomfortable differences and disruptions in the national story. It requires an immense amount of background information and touches on sensitive material to do with control of manpower, conscription and power networks. Here again the anecdotes go quiet. It's just resolved with, after the Front Palace incident, Chuang retired from public life, which is not true. As in any country, there are historical moments that are either perceived to be catalytic, leading to reversals and new beginnings, or become symbolic, used as a shorthand with multiple meanings and signals. These types of historical moments get a lot of attention. I often think about the dates and events that people seem to obsess about. The revolution of 1932, when absolute monarchy ended, or the student uprisings and crackdowns of the 1970s, or the recent events in 2010. I think about the way these events and movements are discussed and used, and of the social and political demarcations that emerge. These moments, which can be polarizing, seem to be part of a much larger picture that takes in centuries and half-forgotten events. They reach back to grey areas, for example, the transition from the Kingdom of Thonburi to the founding of Bangkok, which speaks of anxieties that would play out in 1932. That foreshadowing of doom we might recall crops up in the city pillar folklore, which iterates a prophecy, an apocalypse set 150 years into the future in 1932. Arguably, people know of these things. Past is charged with power because it takes on monstrous proportions, iceberg-like under the surface of Thai consciousness, ready to sink the innocent passerby. This is in the nature of our history, I maintain, because we cannot speak directly to the past or don't want to. Perhaps we prefer to keep things juicy and conspiratorial and indistinct. The Front Palace incident, which can still be a fraught subject, leads into another shadowy episode, the Knox affair. John Knox had been a military drill master for the second king, and he had seen to it that the Front Palace's armed forces were some of the best and most well-equipped in the country. After the standoff between the king and the Front Palace and the so-called conservatives under Chuang, Knox became British Consul General. John Knox had a half-Thai daughter called Fanny, and he managed to marry her to a Thai nobleman who was an enemy of Chuang. This marriage was considered illegal, since the king had not been consulted, and it risked involving the British too much in Thai affairs. It then happened that Chuang had John Knox's new son-in-law arrested and executed for corruption. Fanny Knox fled to Singapore, and John Knox attempted to get the British government to intercede and punish Chuang. Bad blood around this curious episode remains. It slips from being a historical incident in which John Knox appealed to the British Parliament to send a warship to becoming a bit of gossip and rivalry between two old families in Siam. And it was these scandals that I found appealing, where history becomes anecdotal, where facts turn to whispers, the stuff of Thai life. The juicier the story, the more likely they are to persist in some folk memory or gossip trace, and the more likely there'll be some kind of leaky explanation given. Perhaps in the end, none of this matters. I mean, everyone dies eventually, and everything's forgotten, so why not let it all go? I would say that the more the complex and unsettling episodes are ignored and buried, the more dull and textureless the national story becomes. In any case, things are not really forgotten, they just become ghost stories. So if the histories are seen to have gaps, what do we have? What is the character of early modern history? We know that the first Western-style histories were written by Bunnag in the reign of King Rama V. King understood the benefits and uses of historical consciousness and made a concerted effort to foster it. He commissioned Bunnag, who was a man of letters and a leading minister, to write histories of the first reigns. Cam would rely on the chronicles and personal testimonials. He pieced together a narrative, but it wasn't quite a national story as far as I can discern. It's a record of events and personages. The next big figure in Thai historiography is Prince Damrong. He was a half-brother of King Rama V. He was active in many spheres, particularly in the reign of King Rama VI. He is in some ways the father of Thai history. He was certainly a prolific writer and an energetic censor and editor. I don't want to demonize. I find him a very interesting figure, but he was known to go through the old histories and texts, cleaning things up. He edited Cam's histories, removing what he saw as sexual improprieties and acts of sedition, and he edited the ancient Thai epic Kunchang, Kunpan, taking out things he felt undermined the moral fibre of the story. Some of these texts have been restored. There was a recent reprinting of one of Cam's histories, returning it to its pre-Damrong form, and I recommend Chris Baker and Pasok Pongpaichit's excellent translation of Kunchang Kunpan, which again restores and annotates the text so you can see the differences. Prince Damrong was a man of his times. There's not much use in attacking his actions. I believe he wanted to instill and promote a Thai consciousness. For instance, his book, Our Wars with the Burmese, sets up a national enemy, story of national struggle. The narrative he presents is compelling, although I think the realities of the Burmese wars are much more nuanced. So these are the foundations of modern Thai historical identity. There are patrons and there are agendas, just like in any national story. It doesn't mean that there's no value in the old text. It just means that a kind of doublethink starts to set in, a questioning of what else might have occurred, what is missing, why things may not add up. This, again, is why the foreign accounts can be useful, not because they are without agenda, but because their agendas are different. Foreign accounts gave me colour. They fleshed out the individuals and were often unflattering, but while they could be condescending and even racist, they were humanizing. With that, I'm going to look back at some of the material gleaned from these sources. First traveller account that I used was from a Persian source, translated in the 1970s as The Ship of Suleiman. It describes a Persian embassy to the court of King Narai in the Ayutthaya period. The envoys encounter a large Persian community. My ancestor Sheikh Ahmad does not appear, he would have been dead by then, but they do talk about the fate of Ahmad's nephew, Aga Muhammad Astarabadi. This man had been executed by Narai some years before the Persian emissaries arrived. They tell us that Aga Muhammad Astarabadi had been a key figure in the palace coup that placed Narai on the throne, that he'd been rich and powerful, and falling from favour had been put to death in a terrible manner after being tortured for several days. Persian record is supported by Thai sources, but it adds a lot of detail about the Persian community, made up of Turks, Armenians, Georgians, Anatolians, men who had hammams and beautiful houses, and who spent a lot of time squabbling with each other. Persian envoys had arrived too late. After the execution of Aga Muhammad Astarabadi, a Greek called Constantine Falcon had the king's ear. The Persians wrote, "A great disorder has crept into the country's administration, and the channels of procedure have shifted their course. The change of power is due to errors committed by the Iranians, their hypocrisy, and their total lack of agreement among themselves." Persian account is flowery and full of anecdote about raging elephants and gardens that never taste autumn. It is a narrative about a fabulous place where things are upside down and unpredictable. Take, for example, this story. Once there was a great poet whose empty stomach brought him to Siam to sell his talent. He decided to dive into the sea of fantasy and bring up a splendid pearl from the jewel box of his mind. For his effort, the poet was awarded with the title Saplap by the Siamese, which meant liar, and was one of the worst terms of abuse.